Council? Exactly. Okay, I'll call the meeting to order for the special meeting for March 7, 2017. Before we go any further, I would excuse Martin Moore. He's unavailable due to business concerns this evening. So would you all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. So we've got a study session, small cell technology and proposed legislation, Senate Bill 5711. Actually, I'll turn it over to Mark Orthmann at this time.
Thank you, Mayor Farrell. Council members, tonight we have Daniel Kinney of Ogden Murphy Wallace here to present on small cell technology. 5 of you were at the LUTC meeting last night and heard a similar presentation from another member of Daniel's firm, Scott Snyder. After you've had a chance to ruminate about that after last night, you may have additional questions. But essentially, this is new technology that is coming to the right-of-way, and it, due to the federal overlays, it will be something that we will be needing to deal with, and Daniel and his firm are going to be helping us work through that process through a variety of code amendments and regulatory overlays. And with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel Kinney.
Great. Well, thank you for having me tonight. Again, I'm Daniel Kinney. I'm an attorney at Ogden Murphy Wallace. I work with Scott Snyder and Alana Zana on small cell issues, telecommunications issues. And I understand that almost everyone, except for maybe 2, heard his presentation last night. And I think by design that was going to be a little bit smaller, and then I'd catch everybody else with the same presentation today. So I would say that as we get going, if there's an overlap or if questions come up, by all means, please do interrupt me and ask questions. It might be an opportunity to ask questions that maybe didn't come up last night or that have kind of ruminated since that time. Of course, I think Scott and I probably talk about it a little differently in terms of our lingo and everything, but the gist should be the same. So by all means, if you want to hit fast forward, you can do that as well. But I do know that I have 2 new individuals that need to, oh, just one. Okay, great. So
There's a fast forward button up here?
yeah, so somewhere up there, I'm sure you can find it. but by all means, you know, I want to give you all the information you need as well. So you've got the trump card on that. So, okay, so small cell technology is coming on the heels of what we see out right now for our cell phones and our cell towers called macro cells. So macro cells are essentially what you would see a large tower with 1 or multiple arrays of antennas on that tower that's spitting out the signal for our cell phones. Those a lot of times could be on water towers, they could be on towers that are in parks, a lot of times on private property. So that's kind of the paradigm that everybody's working with now, this is how we get cell service and reception, and if somebody comes to the city looking to put more cell coverage into a city, they're looking to do more of that. So they've tried to add more existing sites to that, but what they're trying to do now is to fill in gaps using small cell. And I've got a couple of graphs that show kind of the increase in data consumption over the years, just to show how exponential this is getting. So you can see here, we're right there in the middle at 10.7 exabytes per month, and it's only going to, 2.5 times by 2019, I believe that is. And then on here you can see on this slide, this is actually taken from Mobility, which is one of the prime participants in the process, if you will. And one of the interesting things that I thought was the first percentage on the upper left, 84% of today's shoppers use their smartphone to help shop in store. So when you think about that, people are using their data on their smartphones to do things that they've never needed it for in the past. And this kind of gets to a phrase called the Internet of Things. Has anybody heard that before? Did Scott bring that up last night? No? So the Internet of Things it's an actual term that's out there. And basically what that does is that captures everything that's going to use data going forward. That can be things from smart streetlights, smart utility monitors, smart cars, self-driving cars. I would guess that pretty much anything you can think of that could gather some sort of data is going to gather it and send it someplace so that somebody can monitor it someplace. I think there are refrigerators that have a little camera on the inside that not only does it show it on the outside, but it tells you what's in your fridge on your phone. So these are things that are using data now that they didn't 2 years ago. So just think about what's going to happen in the next 2 years.
I've got a question because I've been thinking about this for a lot. When I see the self-driving cars and all these new automated things, what happens when hackers hack into those things?
You tell me.
Yeah, well, you know,
I
this
mean,
sounds like, you know, this sounds like we're moving to everything being in the cloud and on, and all of this stuff, and hackers are out there.
Well, I mean, not to get too current events, but I mean, WikiLeaks just released things about
Yeah,
data-driven TVs, right? So
Yeah.
whether or not somebody could get into those, I would say that for our purposes for this conversation, that's to the side. That's going to be something for these companies to deal with and for the technology to understand and adapt to going forward. On top, so just at a baseline, cell phone usage, the data for cell phones itself is going to necessitate the need for a change, and that's where we're going. The layer on top of that is all this other stuff, all of which has a data concern, certainly. So this is an AT&T graphic. So just the data usage, and this is essentially the iPhone lifespan right here. So you can just see when smartphones got going, it just took off. And so all of these carriers are trying to figure out a way to adapt and get ready for what's coming down the line even sooner. So this is the different technologies. On the right is the macro towers. These are the ones with the arrays that we see out there. Small cell is at the 30-foot range on light standards and power poles. And this is where they're going. And we've got a good graphic to show this. And I hope Scott used this description last night because I find it very helpful. The macro towers are a flashlight held at 5 feet high, shining an array of light down on the ground. Everybody gets a little bit of light, but it's not that much. If you need to fill in gaps in that circle, you need to put another flashlight much closer to the ground to get a brighter circle down where that's needed. And so that's what the small cells are here in the small circles inside of a macro site array, if you will. So what telecommunications carriers are doing is they're coming to cities and they're asking to put what they call polygons into a city, which is a series of nodes, just like this depiction here, to fill in gaps that they've identified. So if that's by a transit hub, and in the mornings and the evenings, there's a ton of people sitting there reading the news and watching TV, waiting for their bus. They might need to put something there because they don't have proper service. It could be a stadium, it could be in a dense residential area, apartment building, corridor or something like that. And then also they're doing it to boost speeds. So the more people you get on there, the more speed you need and the more density that you have. So that's the identified need. The secondary need, which comes into the franchising conversation, is that within the lifespan of a franchise, we're going to get to 5G. So most all of our phones are on 4G network right now, which generally speaking is pretty quick, pretty good coverage, data speeds are good. The next wave in all the cell phones that are getting created right now that will come out next is going to be 5G. The federal government needs to tell us exactly what that bandwidth looks like, what those that coverage will come out on, that will receive it on. And once that's done, 5G is all small cell. So no longer will we be pulling off of macro towers exclusively. The small cells that they're putting in now is not going to solve the problem of 4 years down the line when 5G comes out. So when a carrier comes and says, we want to put 6 small cells in your city to identify gaps in coverage or needs for greater speeds, that's fine. But if they're asking for a citywide franchise to install small cell, within the lifespan of that franchise, they could go back out and put 90, 200 for this city. It's a large, long city. So there's a lot of potential. Again, just like we saw on all of the graphics, within a 10-year span, things could change.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Can these small cell boxes be temporarily located and then moved around the city as the carrier needed to get more during the day?
During the day?
Well, so let's say they're located at the transit center in the morning and the evening, but in the afternoon there's something going on at a park or here at City Hall. Could they be located so that they could be moved around the city, or are they stuck to the pole?
I think the quick answer is no. There's an infrastructure that they have to install. We'll get to some pictures to really see what it takes, power, backhaul, feeding it. However, there are companies like Mobility that do have trucks that can be taken to locations and spit out reception, if you will. So that concept, in theory, is possible, but that would be more for Seahawks win this year's Super Bowl. There's a big parade. Mobility says, we're going to be the people that makes it so everybody can post on social media. And they put, 4 trucks along the route, and then that could, make it happen.
Okay,
I'm not saying they'll do that, but.
thank you.
Daniel, thanks for your time here. Just so I understand, with the macro cells, that's basically that's handling everybody that's within coverage area, right?
Correct.
These micro cells are more about handling peak demand in higher usage areas, is
Yeah.
that, or to fill in a gap that's not covered by the macro cell? So it really does both to a certain extent?
Yeah, it does both. I mean, there could be a circumstance where in this large circle for the macro site, topography could make a valley tough.
Right.
And it frankly could be a pretty small valley, let's
Sure.
say. One residential street or what have you. So you could pop small cells there to make that work. Those small cells would be fed by backhaul fiber that would get the bandwidth there, and then it would spit it out. My understanding of their goals is more to put more light on it rather than,
Okay. So it really is more for peak demand?
essentially, yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes. So, and I'm going to kind of gloss over this a little bit. The state has defined what small cell technology is. 3-foot enclosure for the antenna, 17 cubic feet for the primary enclosures for the boxes. This is going to change. This is already dated. If you talk to any of the carriers and they say, and you ask them and you say, can you fit your small cell within this definition that the state has provided? They'd say, of course. That's an absurd question. It's only going to get smaller and more advanced. So our goal would be to continually try to advocate for this to get smaller with the technology, because things like shrouding and concealment and camouflage are going to be required. So we want to make it so that they are staying as small as they can, and then we can make it so you basically never see it. So this is just a quick graphic that shows the macro site on the top of a building, wherever that might be, top of a hill, and the small cells down in between. And this is, like I was saying, this is their goal right now, for their needs right now. They've identified in this graphic 4 areas where they need more coverage. So they're going to put those small cells in there. But right in the middle of that graphic, once 5G comes out, that middle, on the ground in the middle, wouldn't have coverage with a small cell, and that would make 5G impossible. So like we have 3G and 4G now, you kind of fall back to the 4G. Those people are going to be falling back to dated technology.
Do you know how quickly 5G will be around? When that will be coming?
If I recall, it's a few years out. The federal government needs to define the bandwidth, and then they need to implement everything. So it has not been even defined yet. And that's part of the problem. They know it's all going to be 5G, small cell, but they don't know where they're going to be in that spectrum, so they can't roll it out now.
Thanks.
Yep. So here are some examples that we're going to go through of proposed sites in the northwest area of small cell. So on the left side is the graphic representation, and on the top of the pole are the antennas, the small cell antennas. And I think, from my perspective, this is one that looks great. This is something where you basically don't notice what's on top of the pole. It looks like a light standard, and everything associated with the small cell, the boxes, the wires, and everything are inside the hollow pole, going down to the base where you've got more room to put things. So this is a standard to shoot for. And this is also a similar standard to shoot for, where you've added the small cell on the top, and then you've put a clean, relatively small base station or box down at the bottom. This brings up a lot more concerns that you at least need to address. There are requirements for ADA requirements for the sidewalk, that you need to make sure that the box and the pole don't get in the way. You also don't want to have every single pole in your city with a box right next to it. For the most part, poles like this would accommodate one carrier's small cell. And so if all carriers need to be in your city and these only have a quarter-mile radius, you're going to have, am I out of time? No. If everybody has to have one of these and they're going to be one every 4 blocks and you have 5 carriers, you're going to have lots of different poles with small cell on it. So you certainly don't want to have poles and boxes everywhere. So while this is good, it's not bad, certainly something to take into account. And here's another Seattle one, and this one is different because everything that's associated with the small cell is actually on the outside of the pole, as opposed to the first one was inside, the second one was fed all the way down to a box. So you can see that it's been, relatively concealed. It's color-coded to the pole, so you can't really see it. The wires aren't hanging out everywhere except for right at the boxes. And one, and I don't think I've got a picture of it, but for example, the hanging banner on the pole here, a lot of times in San Francisco, they made proposals where they were putting the boxes associated with the small cell behind the speed limit sign, or even between 2 banners, or whatever it might be. So you actually never would see it, but in fact, it's on the outside of the pole in total daylight, but the way that they've positioned it makes it work really well. So here's one that I'm not a fan of. And this is one where there's just a lot at play here. So you have the antenna on the top, generally speaking, that's fine, but you can see wires coming out of it immediately and being fed to the side of the wood pole. And this is one of the issues that wood poles have, is that there's a requirement that they have to be away from a power pole. So that's required. That's not something that they chose to do, but at the same time, it just clutters everything. And then the radios and the fiber termination box, they have a new fiber line coming into the pole that's feeding it. So had this been a replacement pole that was hollow, steel pole that was hollow, that they could have put a lot of this on the inside, it would have looked better. This is where everybody was going really quickly at the beginning because they didn't have a lot of motivation to not do that. The pushback from cities has led to move away from this, hopefully. And again, this is just another example of things you want to avoid when you have multiple pedestals and boxes on the ground that is housing everything, gets in the way of your sidewalk, your green space. And then also, if you were to have this for every small cell, you'd have hundreds and hundreds of boxes in your city. So 2 things that I'm going to go over relatively quickly because we don't have a whole lot of control over them are some legislation that's happening in the state and federal government. So the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, regulates telecommunications in the United States, and they got a petition from Mobility And I assume, are you guys all familiar with Mobility, the company that's kind of started this all rolling forward? Just a little bit at least. So they filed a proceeding with the FCC to seek further definition of a lot of key terms, and the position that they put forward in that action was to essentially broaden it out and give them way more rights to be in the right of way and to have access to what we would consider a city resource. So the response time for that has come and gone. AWC, multiple other cities, the consortium of cities that we're involved with have all filed responses. And I believe it's the National League of Cities was involved with our response. So it has been properly addressed at this point, but this is just like, and I'll shoot forward, well, I'll hold here for a second, the state legislation, which we'll talk about in just 2 seconds. Depending on what happens both federally and with the state, a lot could change for what your city and every other city around here can do to deal with these requests. And one of those requests are polls like this. So this is kind of a hybrid, and this is a little bit different and will be treated different by cities. But this is what's called a transport poll. Mobility is the only entity that is proposed putting these out as of right now. This is a 120-foot pole that is 4.5 feet in diameter. So when you think about that, that is a massive pole, and they are essentially asserting that they have a right to put that in the right of way. So when you think about that, that should be very alarming. There's no community that wants a bunch of these in their right of way. When you add in 6409, which is section that allows these types of structures, assuming they meet certain definitions, to balloon within certain parameters without much oversight, that pole could look a lot different. Frankly, so could the small cells. So keeping a tight rein on all of this and understanding what is going in and that it's going into the right places, and that they have concealment technology requirements, shrouding, camouflaging, so that it's always going to stay looking a certain way. I mean, cities have historic districts, they have business districts, they have residential areas, all of which would require a certain look. I mean, we put into our FCC filing that the consortium of cities that we represented, and I'm not going to get the right number, but it was like $4 billion invested into their rights of way for what they want their city to look like, whether that's a view city where you're undergrounding all your utilities so that you don't have poles and wires everywhere, or if it's a downtown historic district where you're investing in certain types of light standards and things like that. If this legislation goes forward, there's a possibility that these telecommunications companies would have a right to go on to and use those poles in the historic district and put an array on the top of it, or that they would be able to put up their own poles, or that they would be able to put up poles where you've intentionally chosen to invest to underground everything. So these are important considerations going forward. And so the proposed legislation with the state is also ongoing, and as far as I know, they can vote on it as of tomorrow, I think. So it has been moved along fairly quickly, and it's something that all cities, your city included, we need to wait and see what comes out of this. The city interests, both this city and all cities just like you guys, have been advocating for against the changes that have been proposed by Verizon to make sure that basically the sea change that they'd like doesn't happen. Once we know whether or not that's going to happen or what that's going to look like, then codes need to change so that we understand how do we review small cells when they come into the city, what can we charge, how much restrictions can we put on access to the right of way, and really what's our role going to be when 4, 5, 6 carriers come to the city with applications from anywhere from 3 to 300 small cell sites for each of them. How do we deal with that? How does city staff process that? What do they look at? Where are they able to push back and where are they not? So there's a lot at play right there. So we're just going to have to kind of wait and see. though we've been involved with both the FCC and the state legislature to make sure that your interests are accounted for, and we'll see how that all comes down. So that's essentially the gist of it. I know Scott went into the state legislative issues a little bit more. He's been down and met with people and worked with AWC on that more extensively. So with that, I guess I would open it up to questions.
Councilmember Stephens.
Thank you. So with the macro towers, you're not getting rid of the small towers. We still need them, correct? The smaller, the 30-foot towers.
Yeah, well, those are the ones that are coming now. So the smaller, you mean the small cells?
Correct.
Yeah, so the small
So
cells.
you always have the small cells.
Yeah, that's my understanding, yes.
Okay, they don't go away.
No,
But you get the big towers to augment.
no, it's the vice versa. Vice versa. So the big towers are there now, and the small towers will at first fill in gaps as needed, and then they will basically cover the city in a net that will become 5G, the next generation. The large towers, I don't want to speak for the carriers, but my guess is that they will stick around because all of the small cell needs to feed someplace and then move on. So the net of small cell over a city still has to have the larger backbone network to work with. So I guess we'll have to see, but that's my understanding.
Okay. Council, any other questions?
Yeah, okay.
Oh, Councilmember Kopech.
Can the macro towers accommodate the 5G technology?
The way it's been described to me is no.
Okay.
They need to have for speeds and for coverage, they have to have these smaller nodes. And I guess one thing I didn't get into, and I'm sure Scott did, is that all of these small cell nodes throughout the city, whether they start with 5 or whether it's a whole network of them, have to have some way to get and receive the signal. So that's where backhaul fiber comes into play. So y'all have lots of fiber running throughout the city right now, and one of those strands would need to be connected to and brought in. We saw in one of the pictures it was coming in right to the middle of the pole. So that would feed the data in, and then whatever it receives, it would feed it back out. So you're going to have a separate entity. Sometimes it might have some name that looks kind of like Verizon Wireless, but not really Verizon Wireless. Or it might be somebody totally different, Astound, Wave, something like that, that is also going to need a franchise and is also going to have to extend fiber throughout the city to do that. Mobility is a little bit unique because they're using microwaves to shoot the signal between different areas. So they claim they need a little bit of a taller pole for their small cell so that they can get in sight line. Yeah.
Deputy Mayor Burbridge.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. So I'm not clear on to what degree there might be a sharing of equipment, locations, facilities, and it was mentioned at one of the sessions I've been at that Comcast might be setting up its own complete system somehow, but there was no detail given related to that.
So the technology, well, so for all cell bandwidths, so Verizon has a bandwidth that they use for all their people. Sprint does too. So when 5G comes out, they're each going to be given a certain bandwidth. So the antennas and the boxes will be shooting and receiving things within that bandwidth. So to the extent that they come up with technology that generally looks the same and acts the same that can do that with 2 different bandwidths, we've not been told about that yet. They say that it can. There's conflict with the bandwidth and with the data coming in and out, so they don't want to deal with that. They don't, they're not trying to strong arm them in a quarter-mile radius, but they want to put their stuff how they want to do it on their pole. So we'll have to see how that goes. the last time I spoke with them, it seemed like there could be some potential that if you had a 60-foot pole, somebody might be able to be at the top and somebody might be able to be down lower at the 35-foot level. If their bandwidths don't conflict enough and there's different zones on the poles with PSE, they need this transport zone cleared, and if the lines are fine. So I think there's a lot of variables. I think the safe bet is that an individual carrier will be on a light standard or utility pole and will be not keen on having anybody else on that pole.
Thank you.
Councilmember Honda.
Thank you. As with any new technology, when this rolls out, which I understand from a little bit of research could be 2020, 2021, is it anticipated that it'll roll out in the bigger cities before coming to cities our size so that they can see how it works? And I'm sure there'll be limited amounts of folks who can get this up and running, and they'll be focusing on certain areas. Do you have an idea of what areas in the Pacific Northwest that they might be focusing on?
That's a fantastic question, because one would think that they would start with your big cities, your dense cities where your users are. Certainly the Puget Sound area, we've got a lot of tech companies. People rely on their phones, and that's kind of a perception. I will say that Mobility, the company that kind of got this all rolling, reached out to basically everyone. I mean, it was astounding to see. Once we got word that they started to contact some of our client cities, and some other people started calling, and there's some listservs going, they were all over the place. So it's not like they just simply started with Seattle, Tacoma, Portland. It's not what they did. I think that there's a perception that pretty much everywhere is going to need it. And I also think that when we kind of look to the Internet of Things, there's other needs that actually may be greater in areas that aren't as dense. There's farm equipment that is operated remotely that will use this technology. There's utility monitoring that will take place where they don't want to have to connect it with a hard wire or anything like that. So I think there's a perceived need that might look a little different very broadly. But certainly the cost to implement this and roll this out is going to be large. So there certainly would be some sort of rollout, but we're gonna have to see what the carriers decide on for that.
All right, Councilmember Selsky.
Yes, thanks, Mayor Farrell. Yeah, thank you, Dan. Last night in Scott's presentation, he talked a little bit about fee generation opportunity for cities like us. I think he said something in the neighborhood of maybe $400 to $1,500 per year for leasing these facilities, or leasing right of way to the carriers. Do you know if the state has any opportunity for revenue generation, or even the federal government, in rolling this out? And what would be, especially I guess at the state level, what's their motivation driving this legislation?
Another great question. I am not aware of any financial opportunities for the state. I do think that a state like ours would view technological advancement in a better light than maybe some other states. We pride ourselves in our companies that we have here, the people that we attract here. I mean, if we're one of the first places that has advanced 5G, that's a selling feature for the state. Mm-hmm. However, my understanding is that the state senator that brought this forward is motivated to move it along, and has, and I don't know a whole lot about him, but he has involvement with the Trump campaign, or the Trump presidency. So he's very gung-ho on this, and that's the prime reason why it's moved forward. Certainly, the telecommunications carriers have a lot of resources and have a huge interest in moving this forward as well. So it's not like there's not something pushing on that side as well.
So economic development through technology, trying to gain that, I guess, that foothold and that advantage over our competitor states, okay.
Yeah, and I think that one thing to emphasize related to that is, and I'm sure Scott said this yesterday, because we talked about it yesterday as well, is, all of the citizens here in the Pacific Northwest and pretty much everywhere have essentially voted for this, right? Because we all buy our smartphones, we all use them all the time, and that's driving this forward. So, 5G will be coming, and it is something that everybody will take advantage of, and will be a really great thing for your residents here. But the question is, how are we going to get from here to there, and making sure that we keep enough control on how that happens, that the city and the city right-of-ways are maintained properly. It's not going to be to not have this happen, or to slow it down, or only in the certain areas, because it's coming, and that's going to be great. But the control factor and the ability to know what it's going to look like down the line is important.
Okay, thank you.
All right, council, any more questions? All right, thank you very much, great job.
Thank you.
All right, council, any discussion or further questions on this? With that, this special meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene at 7 p.m.